The story I have for you today has quite literally been years in the making. What we found was a possible serial killer at work. 10 eerily similar cases that had never been connected, separated by jurisdiction and bureaucracy. Our story starts with one case, the case that piqued our interest years ago, and that is the murder of Rhys Pocan. On September 2nd, 1989, the non-emergency dispatch line at the Sheboygan County Sheriff's Office in Wisconsin started to ring. The caller won't give his name, but he says earlier that morning, like sometime before sunrise, he and his wife were walking in Nichols Creek, which is this public hunting ground, and they stumbled upon a dead body. So the dispatcher asked, are you sure it's a human body? And the man says, quote, "Oh yeah. It's been decapitated, and it's been there for a while, apparently." Now, he explains that he saw the body about 100 feet off a public access road, and when the dispatcher offers to get a detective on the line, the man's like, no, I just found it, I wanted to report it, I don't want anything to do with this, basically, right? So he hangs up without identifying himself and leaves before authorities actually get to the scene, where they do find the body that he described. And it is in a particularly gruesome state. So this victim is severely decomposed, almost mummified. And the victim's head and hands are missing. And it appears as if the corpse had been scavenged by animals and insects. The insides are literally hollowed out and the skin is almost like leather. And other than the body, though, there is nothing else at the scene. And despite searching far and wide, they don't find any other body parts. They don't find any clothes, no personal belongings, which makes identification essentially impossible. But based on the pelvic bone of this victim, the ME determines that this was a female, and a small scar on her abdomen, plus surgical clips near where the gallbladder would have been, tells them that this Jane Doe likely had a gallbladder surgery. But there aren't any obvious markings or wounds on the body, so the cause of death is undetermined. And strangely, the manner of death is ruled undetermined too.
Ma'am, she was decapitated. How is that undetermined in any way?
I listen, everyone agrees with you, now, but back in the day, I guess the ME, so this guy named Dr. Jeffrey Jensen, says that the head and hands being gone, that could be due to animal predation.
And they didn't take her feet? Animals just came and took the things that could identify her.
I know, it sounds bananas when you say it out loud, but everyone back then was like, well, that's what the ME says, he's the professional. Except, yes, he was a professional, but he was new at his profession at the time. And we actually talked to this doctor for this episode. We asked him to review his own old findings. And he said that if he could do it all over again with what he knows now, his experience, he would definitely list her death as a homicide rather than leaving that line blank. He said that in '89, again, he's brand new to the job. And in talking to us, he admitted that there's just no possible way that her head and hands were actually removed by animals. So anyways, almost 2 months later, the Waukesha County Sheriff's Office, which is just over an hour south of Sheboygan, they get a surprise when a hunter walks into their office with a severed hand in a bag. Now, this man, Russell Martin, says that he was out with his son and their dog, pheasant hunting on October 21st in this big open field, which, by the way, is also a public hunting ground, when all of a sudden his dog starts acting super strange. Off in the distance, he's not right next to him. He's just rolling around on the ground. It's I have Chuck. I know he's rolling in something dead, always. It's terrible. So he's not coming when he calls him. He goes over there to see what his dog's doing, and he gets the shock of his life. He looks at what his dog is so worked up over, and it is a human hand. It looked like a left hand, mostly skeletal, with 4 fingers and no thumb. But thumb or no thumb, there is no doubt what Russell is looking at. So he doesn't call police like they did with the body. He picks up the hand and takes it to the sheriff's office in this little plastic baggie that he had in a first aid kit. And then the sheriff comes out to where he found it. They end up doing this big search of the area, which turns up the other hand, but nothing else.
So basically, in Sheboygan, there's a body with no head or hands, and in Waukesha, there's hands with no body.
Exactly. So Waukesha actually tried getting fingerprints off the hand to try and identify them, but I told you it's like mostly skeletal, like it's not even really possible. But then, I'm not really totally sure like which department it was. Someone has this like light bulb moment and is like, oh, wait a minute, exactly what you said, like, I wonder if these hands belong to that body that has no hands.
Right.
Now, they couldn't definitively connect anything yet, but like, come on, probably. Though, even if they could say that these hands belong to the body, like, you still can't say who this person is, right?
Well, can we at least call it a homicide? Because animals didn't take the hands and drive them 80 miles away.
Of course, we could if they were determined to be connected, right? But they can't for sure say that. Like, this is where DNA would be super useful right about now, but in 1989, in rural Wisconsin, like, forget about it. It's not until like 6 months later, in April of 1990, that efforts are finally made to see if detectives can finally match the Waukesha County hands to the Sheboygan County body, and more importantly, try and identify who they belong to. So lab tests are done out of state, but those ultimately come back inconclusive.
Okay, this might be a dumb question, but I assume they've gone through all of their like cataloged missing people, right?
Not dumb question, no, but yes, they have. So there's nothing in either of these counties that fits the little information they have. But after these inconclusive lab results, investigators decide to broaden their search. And I mean, considering how far apart these remains are, like clearly someone is willing to travel to cover their tracks here. So they start looking as far away as Milwaukee, which is a pretty big city with a lot more missing person reports. And one of them really stands out. There is a 35-year-old woman who was reported missing in August of 1989 named Rhys Pocan. Not only does the timing fit, since she went missing about a month before the body was found, but there is a note in her missing persons report about a gallbladder surgery scar that really raises some eyebrows. And it's that scar that helps detectives confirm, less than a month later, what they've been waiting almost a year to find out. Their Jane Doe is, without a doubt, Rhys Pocan. But now they have even more questions, because the circumstances around Rhys's disappearance are truly bizarre. Now, the story of her disappearance begins on August 10th, 1989. So Rhys had dropped her 8-year-old daughter, Charlee, off with her sister, Flavia, who was Charlie's aunt. And I actually got to meet Charlee, and even all these years later, she says that she can still remember her last moments with her mom vividly. And there are just certain parts of this episode, I'll tell you right up front, that I want you to hear something directly from the person who lived it. And this is one of those. So here's Charlee.
I do remember that day, and it's always kind of just replays in my head. She told me I had to go to my aunt's house, that she was going to watch me. And so we rode our bikes down. She didn't live far from us. And then we got there, and I was like, well, I don't want to stay here. I want to go with you. And she's like, no, you can't this time. You have to stay here. And then I remember watching her ride her bike away, and I kind of, like, I was mad. And then I turned around, and that was the last time I saw her. Yep, it replays all the time, and now I look back and like, it's just kind of weird because I'm watching her, right away, not knowing that's the last time I would see her. But it's really hard when you look back and that was the last time I was going to see her.
Did your mom tell you why you couldn't go with her that day?
She just said I just couldn't go with her that day. That she had. She didn't say.
Rhys's brother Billy also remembers seeing Rhys that afternoon on her bike, and this is likely right after she dropped Charlee off. But he's not totally sure of the timing. He said they spoke for a second, and Rhys seemed like she was in good spirits. She told him that she was on her way to her boyfriend's house. We're going to call her boyfriend Chris. So Chris told Billy that Rhys had stopped by his place, and he puts that at like 2:45, 3 p.m., which would have been right before he left for work. And then Chris says that Rhys headed out on her bike in the direction of nearby National Avenue to go bar hopping. And this is where things start to get weird, because there was this trail of sightings and encounters and even physical signs of Rhys Pocan in the following hours. But sometime before midnight, she seemingly vanished into thin air. So much, all of Rhys Pocan's last movements center around this one strip of establishments on National Avenue. The first sighting of her there is actually around 9-ish at a bar called the Golden Spike Tavern. And apparently, while she's there, Rhys seems pretty drunk or like just out of it. Now, where she was from the time she left Chris's place to the time she got to this bar and how she got so drunk or whatever it is she was, that's unclear. There are no confirmed sightings of her during that period. But the bartender at this bar says that around 10 or 11 p.m., Rhys ends up leaving with this older man named Harry to go like sleep it off at his house.
Oh, I don't like that.
So that was my first reaction too, but apparently like it's not as sinister as it sounds. The bartender says that Harry lives like right around the corner from the bar, and he's known, I guess, to let barflies kind of crash at his place if they're too drunk to drive home, or in Rhys's case, bike home. Mm-hmm. So she says that Rhys just like grabs her backpack and heads out with Harry on foot.
Did she leave her bike behind?
It would seem so. And actually, a few days later, when her brother Billy is trying to retrace her last steps, like on his own, he does find her yellow bike propped up right across the street from Golden Spike Tavern. It's possible she was there, like in between that time. We saw many sightings of her. But anyway, according to Harry, when he and Rhys go to his backyard gate, Rhys kind of like stumbles and drops her backpack in his yard. So Harry like bends over, he picks it up to like hand it back to her. But before he even can, Rhys darted back toward National Avenue. So Harry started walking back toward the bar to return her bag to her, and she's like out of eyesight by this point. And when Harry gets back to the bar, he sees actually Rhys's flip-flops like neatly placed together on the sidewalk outside. So he scoops her shoes up, planning to return those as well. But when he gets inside of the Golden Spike Tavern, she's nowhere to be found. So he just leaves the items with the bartender.
Do we know if Rhys ever made it inside the bar?
That's unclear. But around 11:35 p.m., Rhys encounters a woman named Charlee, who works at the American Indian Council on Alcoholism, which is just down the road from the bars on National Avenue. And I guess Rhys was known to attend this council sometimes, so she wasn't a stranger to Charlee. But Charlee says basically she's working a late night session and was approaching the front doors to leave when she sees Rhys coming inside. And she said that Rhys was incoherent when she tried to speak with her. She seemed to be under the influence of something, but she didn't know what. Charlee thought maybe it was drugs, only because she said she didn't smell alcohol on her. And she said that Rhys's words were like slurred when she's trying to talk to her. She just wasn't really making sense, but she seemed super agitated. And Charlee says that she tried to talk to Rhys, but Rhys sort of just like pushed her away. And from there, Rhys walked off without explanation, without shoes, in the eastbound direction of National Avenue. Now, what's interesting is Charlee told us that her mom did drink a lot, but the only drug she ever experimented with was pot, and not even that often.
But maybe that's something that you keep from your kid.
Totally possible. But I will say the investigator on this case today, his name's Detective Nathan Hatch, he says that seems to kind of be backed up by other family members, like not just her 8-year-old kid. Apparently, Rhys, she did like to drink beer, but she like wasn't into especially hard drugs.
Which makes me wonder if someone like drugged her at the bar.
It makes me wonder too. I mean, it would be great to have other accounts of her behavior or what she said when she sobered up. But this encounter with Charlee at 11:35 p.m. is the last known time that Rhys Pocan is ever seen alive. She never shows back up at her sister's house at the agreed upon time to get Charlee. So Flavia ends up taking Charlee back to Rhys's apartment herself, and not finding Rhys there, she ends up leaving Charlee with the downstairs neighbor, Carla. And Rhys basically lives in this duplex, so she lives on top, Carla lives on bottom. And Carla watches Charlee like pretty regularly since Rhys works full-time, so it wasn't all that odd when Charlee got dropped off. But what was odd was when Rhys didn't show up the rest of the night, or the next day on the 11th, or the 12th. I mean, normally her routine was to pop by every 4 hours or so to make sure everything was good when Charlee was with Carla. But 2 days went by without so much as a word.
And Carla didn't think to tell anyone?
I guess not. And we actually did get to speak to Carla, and she wasn't able to remember exactly what she was thinking at the time. But apparently she, I think, just assumed Rhys would turn up eventually. Now, it wasn't until the 12th that she finally started to get concerned, because that's when Chris, her boyfriend, Rhys's boyfriend, came by looking for Rhys. Apparently, he and Rhys were in this like bowling league together, and she had been totally MIA to their bowling alley date. So he figured that something might be wrong. But it really wasn't until that moment that he and Carla both realized how wrong things were. So they raised a flag for her brother Billy, and he came over to stay with Charlee until Rhys came back. But when she still wasn't there on the 13th, the next day, like, all bets are off. That Sunday, August 13th, Billy reported Rhys missing to the Milwaukee PD, and an investigation began. And really, it's like investigation light, I should say, because police call the local hospitals, they call the jails, but of course, they don't find Rhys in any of those. And 5 days later, at the suggestion of Rhys's mother, Zane, they pulled Rhys's bank records, which showed some transactions on August 7th and 8th and 9th, but nothing on the 10th or after, which is kind of just confirming what they already knew.
Also, leave it to the mom to suggest, like, very routine, basic investigative moves.
I know, yeah. So in all that time that Rhys has been missing, in almost the year before she was connected to that body showing up in Sheboygan, the Pocan family, to your point, is like pretty much their own investigators. Like, they were having to unravel her disappearance themselves. Like, her brother Billy was actually the one who went and canvassed the National Avenue bars in the early days when police wouldn't. And he is the one who found out that her backpack and shoes were left at the bar with the bartender at the Golden Spike Tavern.
Did Milwaukee PD do anything to search for her?
I mean, at a certain point, they follow Billy's lead and start canvassing the bars themselves. But I think that their lack of action probably can be attributed to two things. Number one, 1989 Milwaukee was prime Dahmer time. Like, he gets arrested in 91, and listen, he's not connected to Rhys's story, even though we're talking dismemberments, but it's just proximity and really close proximity. So interesting. As we're in Milwaukee, we were going to all the places that things had happened, like the scene, the bar she was at. And as we're driving, the detective's oh, by the way, that was Dahmer's house. It's literally 6 blocks east of where Rhys's boyfriend Chris lived. But again, just a coincidence that we stumbled across. And I don't think police at any point were ever trying to even connect Rhys to the Dahmer stuff back then, even before he was found.
Right. Dahmer targeted men exclusively.
Exactly. But still, again, this is Milwaukee PD was zeroed in on that investigation and maybe didn't have the bandwidth to dive into Rhys's case as they should have. But the second reason that Rhys wasn't getting the full force of the MPD behind her was likely because of who she was. Rhys was an Indigenous woman and a single mother. And she didn't just leave behind Charlee. She had 3 other daughters too, Barbara, Regina, and Michelle. They were a little older than Charlee. They lived with different relatives out of town. I mean, Michelle was 11 when Rhys went missing. She was living with her grandma. She hadn't seen her mom since she was very little. So all of the sisters had vastly different relationships with Rhys, but her going missing still deeply affected all of them. And actually, the summer that Rhys vanished, Barbara was actually considering moving to Milwaukee to live with her mom and Charlee. So they had to have been pretty close, or kind of close, even though the relationship was long distance. But all that to say, I do wonder if Rhys's scattered family played into this assumption that the police maybe had or were making about her life or her lifestyle. And then just add on top of that assumption, just a general apathy toward Indigenous people. As an adult, Rhys was a member of the Bad River La Pointe Band of the Lake Superior tribe of Chippewa Indians. And there is no arguing that Indigenous people, especially those who go missing or are murdered, are treated vastly different than their white counterparts. And I can say it, but here is where I want you to hear it from someone who has lived it. So this is Rhys's daughter, Michelle.
This happens to our people all the time. And they have reports of these Caucasian women that go missing. Nobody reports about us. It's we don't exist. And there's so many of our women, sorry, they're gone. Nobody knows where they're at. We've been dealing with this for, hundreds of years. And this is something that really just touches my soul. Because it's sad that it's hit my family.
So Rhys's disappearance didn't get much attention, and not just from the police. The press at the time wasn't really talking about this missing mother either. And for Charlee, it sort of seemed like nobody cared about her mom, who just up and vanished.
Well, it was very confusing because I I remember when I went to my aunt's house and she was missing for a while, I remember being very angry and saying, I don't understand why they can't find her. Like, she's probably just down at the bar by our house. Did anybody go there? You know, have they looked there? Have they, you know, why can't they find her? I remember being very upset that I just couldn't understand why nobody could find her.
At this point, Charlee was living with her aunt, uncle, and their 5 sons, and that situation was starting to feel more permanent.
It was a completely different world there. I was used to it just being my mom and I, and that's it. And then all of a sudden I have 5 boys. It was very different from what I had known, and we lived in the country. I was used to the city. It was a pretty big shift, and then obviously not having my mom. But it was nice, you know. It was different having all those people, you know, with you, but I know they cared about me and stuff, so it was good.
Charlee had been living with her aunt for almost 2 months when the call from the Sheboygan County Sheriff's Office came in. They had found Rhys's body. And Charlee still remembers what that conversation was like with her aunt and uncle when they told her.
They had sat us all down, and they had told us that, you know, my mom's remains were found, and, you know, that she had been murdered. And I remember just sitting there and not knowing what to do. It was almost like I was frozen. And then I remember my aunt was like, "It's okay to cry." And then I started crying. And then I didn't know. I know I couldn't process everything. I remember telling my aunt that I remember I had to help her home from the bar one time, and maybe she was sick. And she's like, "No, you know, somebody killed her," you know. And I was like, "Oh, okay, yes, that's right." You know, so I remember just being like very confused and not totally understanding. But it was like I didn't know what to think. I knew they had found her torso, and then I knew her hands and her skull were missing. But I didn't totally know, like, where, you know, they found what. They would share things with me, but I don't remember, like, a lot of the details. My aunt says they told me. They always try to be honest with me. So I don't know if maybe I blocked some of it out, but I don't remember, you know, them really telling me, you know, her hands were found here, or her skull was found here, and torso was found here. Any of those actual details of, you know, or autopsy or anything like that.
Rhys's skull would end up being found more than a year and a half after Rhys went missing in the Vernon Marsh area. And this is about a quarter of a mile from where her hands were found. But finding her skull doesn't progress the investigation much. It's not like it's in a new location that gives them clues. Plus, the skull didn't show any markings or signs of trauma that would indicate even how Rhys died.
Is it weird that they didn't find the skull before?
Possibly, but I mean, Detective Hatch took me to that marsh, and we were talking about the possibility of animal activity there. Like, I mean, it is this big wildlife area, so animals could have easily moved the hands or skull for that matter. Now, Charlee couldn't understand how anyone could have wanted to do this to her mom. No one in their family could. Not even Detective Hatch could, because everyone he spoke with during the investigation had just glowing things to say about Rhys. Her coworkers at the Bradley Center, where she worked as an admin assistant, loved her. Her friends loved her. There wasn't an obvious suspect. Well, that is, until police learned about Rhys's boyfriend, Chris. And there was something that right off the bat set up some pretty big red flags. It was a few of Rhys's siblings who first became suspicious of Chris, like, again, very quickly, and for 2 reasons mostly. One, he had been dating another woman at the same time as Rhys. And apparently he started dating this other woman in July and then continued to see her through September while Rhys was missing. And two, apparently his story kept changing. Like originally he told police that the last time he saw Rhys, she was biking away from his apartment heading south after visiting him on the day in question. But later, he told police that the last time he saw her was in his apartment and that he never saw her biking after that, which is like small inconsistencies, but they stuck out nonetheless. And he also didn't have an alibi for the night that Rhys disappeared. Chris originally told Billy and detectives, again, Billy is Rhys's brother, he said that he was at work while Rhys was at the bars. Now, I don't know if they checked with his work, but even if they did, his shift was scheduled to end at 11 p.m., we know that Rhys was last seen at 11:35, so he would have been off work at the time that something happened to her.
Yeah, it's not really an alibi.
Right. Also, it comes to light that Chris apparently sold one of his SUVs a few weeks after Rhys's disappearance, and they tried back in the day to track down this car, which was a 1972 red and white Toyota Land Cruiser, but they're never able to locate it, which leaves them with a lot of questions about not only Chris, but specifically his car. I mean, without a doubt, Rhys would have had to have been transported, right, in a vehicle from Milwaukee all the way to where she was found in Sheboygan. So, like, there's no way around that. They need a vehicle.
And I mean, what are the odds that Rhys's cheating boyfriend's car conveniently gets sold?
It stands out.
Right after she goes missing.
Right? So, Chris also told detectives that he, by the way, had hunted out in the Vernon Marsh before, which is where her hands and her head end up being found.
And we know perps tend to dispose of things or commit crimes in areas where they're comfortable, that they're familiar with.
But the thing is, they couldn't really tie Chris to Sheboygan or the Nichols Creek area where Rhys's body was.
And on top of that, is there like a motive? Did he have a history of like violence or violence with her?
So, I mean, he admitted to slapping Rhys one time, and Carla, the downstairs neighbor, said she heard them arguing sometimes, but she said it was like normal relationship arguing. And I don't know what that means to Carla, but I don't think it was anything super violent in her mind. I think that everyone who's maybe side-eyeing Chris maybe believes that if he had something to do with it, it might have been just to get her out of the way so he could date that other woman. But even if Chris wasn't violent, if she didn't suffer abuse at his hand, the thing I'll say about Rhys is that she had known what life with an abusive partner was like. Enter suspect number 2, Larry. Larry was Rhys's most recent ex before Chris. The two had started dating after Rhys gave birth to Charlee, and Charlee actually grew up thinking that Larry was her dad, but he wasn't her actual biological father. Still, he lived with Rhys and Charlee in the early 80s, and he definitely had a temper. Like, he was not only violent, but also known to stalk Rhys. And here is Detective Nathan Hatch.
As we took a look at Larry, he stood out to us because he was abusive towards Rhys. Not only did we find medical records of abuse where Rhys had went to the hospital in Black River Falls for abuse, where she had like a broken rib or a contusion on her face or a broken fingernail, that kind of thing. On 3 separate occasions, she reported her boyfriend at that time had abused her. But we also found out that he had dated a girl in Illinois who he was abusive towards as well.
I was scared for my mom. Yep. He was always very loving towards me, and I never had an issue with being afraid of him, but I was definitely afraid of when they would start fighting. And it was really hard because I knew how to call the cops right away. I knew that at a very young age of how to do that, and it's not something the kids should know.
But when detectives speak to Larry, they find out that he was living in Illinois in the summer of '89. And so at that point, they're like, oh, he's out of town. They pretty much just write him off.
Okay, where in Illinois, though? Because this Midwesterner knows that it's just a hop, skip, and a jump from Chicago to Milwaukee.
And it was Chicagoland, like you're right. But at the time, I guess the alibi seemed good enough. Larry's girlfriend says she was with him, so like They're done with Larry. But our reporting team recently got a hold of Larry, and he told us that when Rhys disappeared, they had already been separated for like 2 years. And after he moved to Illinois, he says they didn't visit each other or really stay in touch. He didn't admit to any abuse, but he did say that drinking was a big problem in their relationship. And Larry told us that when he lived in Illinois that summer, he didn't have a car, which was like implying that he couldn't have easily gotten back to Milwaukee. Now, he didn't explicitly say that he didn't visit Milwaukee during his stint in Illinois, but he did explicitly tell us that he did not kill Rhys.
And I assume Chris was denying any involvement in Rhys's murder too.
Yes, and we tried repeatedly to get in touch with him as well, but no luck there. What I know is he told police back in the day that he didn't have anything to do with it, like barking up the wrong tree.
Did anyone ever search Chris's apartment or even Rhys's apartment for that matter?
No and no. I know they did search whatever vehicle that Chris still had, but they didn't find anything in that. And I know that Rhys's daughter, Barbara, actually moved into her mom's apartment after she went missing. And she told police that there was nothing out of place there, which, again, just like seemed like enough for them. Like, okay, thumbs up. So by this point, to try and generate some leads in the homicide investigation, detectives put out the news of Rhys's identification to the local media. And over the next 6 months, a handful of tips come in. Dozens of callers are naming people in the area that they're suspicious of or saying that they might have seen Rhys that night.
Is there anything legit?
Well, it seems like maybe some of the tips could have been, but again, I go back to like, what are the reasons this case didn't get worked? Were they overwhelmed? Did they not care? Whatever. Plus, add the fact that like Detective Hatch told us that the area she was in that night that she went out in had this like criminal element to it. So people were calling in with like all these like names of sketchy people who might have been around National Avenue. And for all the reasons listed above, I think things just got like lost in the shuffle or again, just like not paid attention to, ignored, whatever. Mm-hmm. And none of these tipsters are even naming the same people. So like every single one is different.
And you can't like prioritize who like 5 people are saying it's this
right.
person, everyone's saying someone different.
So they fielded the calls, they run down a few of them. And remember, running them down is no easy task since they were having to make, this isn't Milwaukee. Milwaukee had the missing persons case. Sheboygan has the homicide. Mm-hmm. So to go like try and find these people, to go to the bars, like they're making the hours-long trip down to Milwaukee where she was last seen every time they want to run something down. They don't even have the internet back then, you know what I mean?
Right.
Now, the only super interesting tip is from a man who, in a very roundabout and confusing way, calls in at like 2:30 in the morning one day and tells the dispatcher that he knows who killed Rhys. He says that he was with his friend that night and they picked Rhys up, and when she didn't do what his friend wanted, his friend pulled a knife on her. And
wait, so basically this is a confession?
Kind of, like a hearsay confession. So basically, the caller tells the dispatcher that, like, gives the friend's name, everything, gives an address, which, by the way, the address is extremely close to National Avenue where Rhys was last seen. And the dispatcher keeps trying to, like, get more details about this, like, murderer friend. And the caller says it's so wild. He says, "You're talking to him right now." And so the dispatcher's immediately like, wait, yeah, you're telling me you killed her? And then he's like, no, my friend did. And the dispatcher asks like why he's providing this information. And he's like, I'm just feeling really guilty. And then he goes on to say that he doesn't want to face jail time. But again, he's like, I know my friend killed Rhys because they were together at the Bush Bar that night. And like, that's where his friend picked Rhys up. And then the caller says that about 3 weeks after all of this, his friend told him what he did to her. So he's not even like he was there. So a detective follows up on this call. He actually figures out the name of the caller. And that phone number that he gave actually belongs to the caller's mom. But guess what? That is the extent of the detective work. This call basically, again, call it lost in the shuffle of other tips or whatever. They just stop investigating on that and things go quiet.
So, wait, did they rule this guy out?
No, like the lead just stops getting worked.
They just stop working on it?
Yeah.
Okay, but if things go quiet, this feels like the kind of thing you'd like circle back on when you have absolutely nothing else.
Right? But they don't, which is like a clear mistake because in early 91, some more tips come in. One of them is anonymous, but says that Rhys was seen at the Bush Bar the night she went missing.
Where the caller said she had been.
Right, and it's along the same strip of bars as everything else. And they say she was seen there sometime around 9 p.m. and that she left with a white man.
Potentially the caller who pseudo-confessed and implicated his friends.
And I know he's a white guy. So, it feels very freaking interesting all of a sudden. But when they're getting this new tip, because that other lead got just dropped, they're not putting 2 and 2 together.
Well, we know she's seen after 9 as well. And then, she's alone when she's last seen.
Right. But that doesn't mean that she didn't, meet back up with someone. So,
Right.
I get what you're saying. She's not with him the whole time.
Right.
But they could have reconnected. I think anyone in her orbit that night is worth identifying and getting more information
Totally.
from. Though there is another tip that they get from a woman who says that she knows about a group of people who saw Rhys the night that she went missing just before midnight, which is even more interesting.
Yeah, that feels more promising.
Yes. She says that this group of people knew Rhys and they saw her walking barefoot on National Avenue. Now, East would be away from the bars. But because this tip was third-hand information, detectives were never able to confirm either the Bush Bar thing or this new sighting of her being with this group. So in 1991, that's when the case officially goes cold and all investigative work stops.
And that's it?
For another decade, at least. In 2003, there's this little blip, a strange twist in the case, one that I think throws everyone for a major curveball. So in 2003, Sheboygan County gets a weird call from another police department in the region. And they're like, hey, there's this guy here saying that he knows something about one of your murders. And this man is none other than the previously anonymous caller who first discovered Rhys's body in the woods all those years ago. And I don't know what it is about here and now, but all of a sudden he's ready to talk. So he tells police that he was in Nichols Creek with his girlfriend, by the way, not his wife, they learn, like he previously said. He says they liked to go there to hook up. Also, he says he has this low-key marijuana patch and he's got to check on his crops. So that could explain why he didn't want to give the cops his name back in the day. But police find this man suspicious for a few reasons. One is because when he first called in, he noted that the body belonged to a woman. He said that specifically. I've seen the photos. I've seen the state of decomposition. I don't know how you could tell that.
Well, you even said that it was determined that it was a woman based on
pelvic
bone.
Yes. And then there's the fact that this guy was known, by the way, to hang out at the bars on National Avenue back when Rhys died. And some of his acquaintances were the same people who may or may not have seen Rhys, that group of people. Again, there's rumors about who they were. Mm-hmm. His acquaintances could have been that group of people.
How did they all know each other?
Well, one of the men who may have seen Rhys around midnight or in the group or whatever was reportedly selling pills to the girlfriend of the guy who found Rhys's body. And reminder, she's with him when Rhys is found.
That feels too intertwined to be a coincidence.
Right? You've got somebody who's at the place where she goes missing and somebody who, not only do we know they're familiar with the place where she was, they're the people who freaking called it in and found her. But even though this is a weird tangled web, detectives don't seem to be able to untangle it. So just as soon as it seems like this case is heating up again, it goes back on the shelf with more potential suspects added to the list.
I almost feel like if that guy who found her wasn't a part of what happened to Rhys, then maybe he heard about it and went out there looking to see if the rumor he heard was true, maybe kind of looking into how legit it was.
Right. And he did have that little grow operation I mentioned. And again, grow operation is maybe too big of a word. It's a patch of marijuana out there. So I don't know. I can't shake the feeling that it feels more connected to me. I also can't shake the feeling of why come forward all those years later? Because it's not like he's saying he knows who did it, saying he knows more. But finding this body is weighing on him. You know what I mean? I don't know. More than If I found a body and I called police and they found it, whatever, and I wanted to be anonymous, I don't think I would come forward years later
And be like, I was
and
the
it
one
was
who
me,
called it in.
but I have
Yeah.
nothing new to say. Right. Oh, and one of the other things I forgot to mention, the reason I find it so weird is that in this guy's original call to police, when he wouldn't give his name, he also said that it was dark when he stumbled upon the body. And again, like I said, like this body isn't in a state that you could tell the gender, even under fluorescent lights, let alone in like a pitch black field.
Right.
So all of these tips are coming in. But for Rhys's daughter, Charlee, it felt like answers in her mom's case were further away than ever.
My family didn't really want to talk about it, that it hurt too much. And I understood that, so I just kind of let it go. And I kind of, so many years had passed and they never found anybody, so I just assumed, well, that's kind of just the way it is. And that's just, there's not going to be anything that comes of this. I don't think I was too hopeful that anything would come of it. So I just didn't want to maybe bring myself through that pain of not finding answers. Because it had been so long. And I felt like there was nobody investigating. There was, I just forgot, like she was forgotten.
Over the next couple of decades, they actually reopen the case a handful of times when various tips come in, but every time after a few months, the case just ends up back on the shelf. And this goes on pretty much until 2017 when Detective Hatch is assigned the case almost 30 years later. But even then, Detective Hatch is still working other active cases for the sheriff's department, so he's only able to focus on Rhys's in between those assignments. In that time, though, he is able to check off important things. Like in 2018, he sends a bone from one of the hands to a lab in Texas to definitively connect that bone to Rhys. Then in 2021, AudioChuck enters the chat. So that's actually when I hired our reporter, Emily. She was our first reporter on my other weekly show, The Deck, and she was planning a reporting trip to Sheboygan County, Wisconsin to cover some Deck episodes when she came across Rhys's case. So she asked the sheriff's office for an interview about her because she could only find like 1 or 2 lone articles about this woman. And she was the only case in the county not on the Wisconsin cold case card deck. And we just kind of became obsessed. So Hatch said it was actually Emily coming along that really sparked him to go all in on this case. But hi, like in case you haven't looked at the calendar yet, it's 2025. We have been playing the long game. Hatch had to do the unsexy part of investigating first, like digitizing the case file. But when he was ready to start the investigative work, there was one person at the top of his list that he wanted to look into first. And that was Larry.
The ex?
Mm-hmm.
I thought he was ruled out for being like, just across the border
Right.
in Illinois during Rhys's disappearance.
Right. Like that's, again,
That's the point.
Yeah, exactly. But here's the thing. So what I appreciate about Hatch is he's like, I want to do my due diligence. Like I'm going to get the alibi for myself. And he sees what we see. Like he can't tell if him being in Illinois was like meaningful. And honestly, was that even corroborated by anyone?
When we talked to him, he says, well, I couldn't have done it. I was in Illinois. I was in Chicago. So I talked to his girlfriend, and I was able to find out from her that she remembers the Pocan family calling her house, looking to see if they could identify where Rhys was, right? And he didn't know, or said he didn't know. And she recalls, well, he couldn't have done it because he was home with me, but I reminded her that the homicide didn't take place, within minutes or hours of that phone call. So I wondered where he was prior to that. And she said about 3 or 4 days leading up to that phone call, he was gone for several weeks at that time. So to me, that just his alibi, went away.
Well, that changes things.
Exactly, because think about it. Chicago isn't that far from Milwaukee.
Right.
If Larry had access to a car, he could have popped into town easily. Of course, Larry said he didn't have a car, but Detective Hatch actually found a driving infraction for Larry in Illinois that summer, which proves that at some point he at least had access to a car even if he didn't own it. Like semantics, Larry, Jesus. So even though it's possible, it doesn't prove anything. And Hatch doesn't want to get tunnel vision. He also wants help. So in 2022, he goes to a MMIW webinar where he finds out about the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which is a federal agency that in part works to address issues like violence, missing persons, and other serious crimes affecting tribal communities. So he reaches out to them to get more eyes on the case, and they're actually able to assign a special agent to help with the investigation. This guy's name's Michael Potter. And together, Hatch and Potter re-interview multiple suspects, including Chris, including the caller who initially discovered Rhys's body, and some men who popped up in initial tips. And they conduct a number of polygraph exams with help from the FBI. And of the 7 people total that they try to give polygraphs to, 4 of them refuse, 3 accept. Of the 3 who accepted, only 1 showed deception. And I guess this was one of the guys who reportedly saw Rhys around midnight the night she went missing. But then after, he then refuses to answer any further questions.
And all these guys are still alive.
They are, which is like the wild part. We don't often see that in cold cases.
Yeah.
Listen, we actually tried. We're not naming all of them. We tried to contact all of them. Nobody had any interest in talking to us. But anyways, around this time, detectives also finally follow up on that suspicious confession phone call from 1990.
Finally!
Yeah, the one where the caller told the dispatcher that his friend killed Rhys after picking her up at the Busch Bar. So they went to this implicated friend's house. And Britt, you won't believe this, but he lives not 6 houses away from where Rhys was last seen. So Detective Hatch actually took Emily and me on a ride-along. I mentioned that before. And I'm not kidding. I could be standing at where the Busch Bar and Alcohol Alliance used to be. Alcohol Alliance is where she's last seen. And I could throw a rock and hit this guy's front door, which to me makes this mysterious friend actually a lot more interesting. So when detectives pay him a visit in 2023, he tells them that he's not interested in being interviewed. He does admit to knowing the confession caller, though. And the cops actually play the call for him right on his stoop, but he wanted no part of any of it. And they say he became combative. So that was that.
Do they go back to the confession caller himself?
They do. He tells detectives that it's not his voice on the old recording call. He says, he's like, you got the wrong person, even though it was pretty clear who it was. And then he refuses to take a polygraph. And when Detective Hatch hands him his business card, hey, if you change your mind, we would love to talk to you. The guy, he's like, I'm going to rip this up when you leave. So cool. And it's worth noting, where this guy lived back when Rhys went missing, it was just a half block north of National Avenue, specifically the same cross streets where the Busch Bar was. So even he's super close.
And again, I have to ask, how could this all be a coincidence?
I know. Tangled web. I told you. Basically, there's a lot of smoke here, but they can't find the fire. So in 2023, detectives track down Larry again. They try to talk to him in person. Now, obviously, he's not in Illinois anymore. It turns out that in the early 90s, Larry moved back to Wisconsin and had been living in Black River Falls with a long-term partner. Now, initially, he agrees to come in, take a polygraph, but then he ends up changing his mind. No go. But by this point, some polygraphs given, some interviews, ripping up cards, Hatch is invested. So in September 2023, he gets Crime Stoppers to put up 11 billboards with Rhys's picture and information. And he even gets some put up near Larry's house. Last we spoke to Hatch, he had interviewed about 45 more people in connection with the case. And while he was busy doing that, Emily was doing some of her own work on this case, but also on the other cases because, hi, again, we have the deck. We're trying to collect cases from all over for another weekly show. You have to be juggling 10 cases at a time. And I'll never forget this moment. We were in the office and Emily comes in. I'm in the conference room and she's like, hey, I think Rhys's case might be connected to a bunch of others. And I think there might be a serial killer in Wisconsin that nobody knows about except for me.